Okay, David Bollier is in studio this Sunday, November 14th, 7:30 p.m. MEF will host a benefit screening at Amherst Cinema of This Land is Our Land to benefit the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts. And we've interviewed a lot of people who have done these kind of partnership movies with MEF. It's usually based on a book that they've written previously. Tell us a little bit how you got involved with this MEF partnership.
Well, I've been a writer and activist for many years on the commons, which broadly defined are the many things we morally or legally own but don't necessarily control, and the things we share, like the atmosphere, the airwaves for broadcasting, the human genome, water, and so forth. And I've been writing and researching a lot about how these are being privatized and turned into market commodities, even though often they have much greater value to us as something we can all have access to and share.
What's an example, a specific example? I mean, you mentioned generally, but what's a specific example of one that has been turned into a product that maybe we all see every day?
Well, bottled water is a great example, where lots of communities, their groundwater is being taken over by major multinational bottling companies, put into bottles, and sold as branded product. Meanwhile, the local ecosystems often suffer as a result of the draining away of this water, and public infrastructure for tap water is eroding and declining, sometimes catastrophically.
Now, to play devil's advocate, I'm sure if we asked the water bottle companies or bottled water companies about this, they would say, well, we're adding value here because we're either filtering the water. Sometimes I hear it's just tap water that's being run through a filter, or we have put infrastructure in place and have hired people and are creating jobs to get the water. What about that argument?
Well, typically companies, especially large companies, are all about taking unacknowledged subsidies from the commons, often at bargain rates, sometimes in collusion with the government, and then whatever they find wasteful or costly to deal with as a company, they dump back into the commons. So there isn't a full cost accounting of all the costs. Sometimes the water that these bottled water companies are taking has been made pure and clean because governments have set aside conservation lands or wetlands that purify the water, or perhaps they filter it and go to great expense to test it. Well, these are things that the bottled water companies are sort of free riding upon. So their costs don't really reflect the full cost, and yet they're charging oftentimes many, many times more than the actual cost of tap water.
So let's assume that bottled water is something that people would want. And, there's a whole other set of arguments that say, hey, we're wasting a ton of plastic. There's a much better way to deal with drinking water. But let's assume bottled water is something in general people would want to have. If we eliminated the profit from it, so in other words, if it was run the exact same way, except it was, I don't know, a government entity or even a private corporation, but they said we are going to run this without profit, would that be better? Or what would be an acceptable way to administer the fact that people want bottled water without giving away, without the issue of turning the commons into something private that you mentioned?
Well, I suppose the bottom line is, does the public who owns many of these resources or is the steward of the resources have adequate say in how that resource is used and deployed? So partly it's a matter of participation and democratic control over resources. Part of it is whether they should be turned into a market resource in the first place in a way that doesn't take full account of the costs. So, if you can find a nonprofit or government or somebody who takes, or even a company who takes full account of the costs, that's great. But most companies are more intent on maximizing their private gain and are indifferent or hostile to the broader ecological or public costs.
Vaccines is one that I'd be interested in talking about. So in theory, there is money being put in, research and development money, by private companies to develop vaccines for different things, and presumably somebody is going to find the vaccine first. What are they entitled to for having been the ones who found that vaccine?
Well, let's back up a little bit. First of all, did they do all that research themselves? Most of the therapeutically significant medicines and vaccines are financed by us, the taxpayers, through the National Institutes of Health. And then the drug companies tend to get involved after the major scientific work has been done, which is the risky, more expensive research. They cherry pick it for the more promising, more marketable drugs, as opposed to maybe the therapeutically significant ones or the ones that serve important niche diseases. And so they're really kind of free riding on a lot of the, quote, socialized research that we taxpayers do. And yes, companies that invest a lot of money to develop a drug deserve a return on their investment. Patents are play an important role in that. But no, they shouldn't be entitled to simply free ride on a lot of our investments in these drugs.
So presumably, once the vaccine is completed by one individual company, how do we manage that? Do we say a portion of their profits from that need to get cycled back in, or how do you?
Or they could have a non-exclusive license where other companies could compete using the same resource, the same federal research. Why should they necessarily have exclusive rights to something that has mostly been, taken 80% of the distance? Let's have a competitive system over it. Or even better yet, why should private ownership be linked to the drugs that are created? After all, there's lots of very smaller niche drugs for which perhaps there's not a sufficient market. Should the people in the third world there's tens of millions of people with serious diseases there, river blindness, many other diseases, and they're simply too poor to command a market. So therefore, we should create no drugs for those people. That's what the patent system essentially results in. Lots of people having serious needs, but not having the market power to elicit new drugs.
To follow that up, would that not make it less likely that some of those private companies would develop some of the vaccines if they know once we do it, it's getting split, it's being opened up to others? Aren't you going to de-incentivize in some sense?
That's possible, but then, of course, as we discussed in the film, This Land Is Our Land.
Which I should mention, Sunday, November 14th, 7:30 p.m. at Amherst Cinema, amherstcinema.org for tickets.
The development of the polio vaccine by Dr. Jonas Salk and his colleagues was financed by the March of Dimes. And lots of people donated small amounts for this. And when journalists asked him, well, should it be patented? He said, well, could you patent the sun? And the point, of course, is that certain humanitarian things shouldn't necessarily be dictated entirely by the market. There is an important role for the market in the development of drugs, vaccines, and medical treatments, but there's enough else that's of great humanitarian importance that we can devise other mechanisms for doing that. Decoupling patents from the research that's done might be an important way to start.
In the movie This Land Is Our Land, there's a mention of a town that sold its name on the internet for $75,000. I forget what it was, but it was
an Oregon town, and it was during the dot-com boom, and they decided they could pick up I think it was $75,000 or $100,000 from selling their name. And we cite that example in the movie to show how everything is for sale, even things that we thought were beyond the reach of the market. And that's kind of a worrisome trend when everything can be bought and sold.
Well, so what if somebody says, I don't think everything should be able to be bought and sold, but who cares if a town sells its name? I mean, if that's what they want to do, they need money, they take that $75,000, and who knows what positive things they're doing with it. Who cares?
Well, partly it gets down to our identity as a society and people. To say that everything should be bought and sold is to say that everything is fungible, that we don't have any lasting commitments to each other, that we don't even have a notion of the common good. After all, if everything can be bought and sold, perhaps even politicians might be bought and sold.
Perhaps. I mean, obviously. That's
and that's maybe an equal symptom of this mentality that everything should be bought and sold. Perhaps votes should be sold. Perhaps babies should be sold. Perhaps, human ova should be bought and sold. Well, to say any of that implies a certain notion of what human beings ought to be about, what we as a community ought to be about. And those are questions I think deserve far more scrutiny as the market ethic takes over everything.
Who should determine what things are okay to be bought and sold and which things aren't?
Well, certainly right now the sellers, the companies, seem to be in the driver's seat for pushing this ethic.
So unless it's against the law, you can take whatever you want and you can sell it.
For example, the whole field of nanotechnology, which is very microscopic matter that is synthetically created. Harvard owns more than 10 patents on nano matter, which can supplant current elements of the periodic table. And it's equivalent to Microsoft taking what might be freely shareable code and making it proprietary. So we can have all sorts of proprietary matter that companies who own the patents can reap all the profits from.
So somebody could say, okay, all the helium in this room, we own the helium.
Or, well, what would happen is the proprietary helium would replace the natural occurring,
helium, right.
which is what has happened in software, which has happened in water, which has happened in a lot of things. GMO seeds, genetically modified organism seeds, are essentially proprietary substitutes for seed that used to be freely shareable. So once you start to get this, you start to get concentrations of corporate and political power. So it's not merely a, quote, free market.
Right.
It's supplanting a lot of relationships, social relationships, and civic democratic relationships with a buyer-seller market relationship.
When we think about, it's very easy to come up with a long laundry list of things going in the wrong directions with the commons. But when we think about gains over the last 10 or 20 years to the commons, my sense is that the internet has been, if I had to pick one thing that has opened up the door to the growth of commons of different types, that would be it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. The internet is like a super commons, a hosting infrastructure for it. And between that technological infrastructure and licenses such as the Creative Commons licenses, which allow you to legally share your content without it being automatically locked up as property, and then, of course, the social norms that people have developed, you have literally thousands of robust commons like Wikipedia,
Sure.
Free software like Linux, and then countless other smaller or lesser known ones where people get together and say, we want to share this resource and manage it ourselves. And the interesting thing is there's now a common sector of communities that are producing stuff equally as valuable as the market, but without money, without contracts, without lawyers. And this is kind of confusing to conventional economics. People can do this stuff without having monetary incentives, yet Wikipedia is blowing encyclopedia out of the water. It's happening really across the board in the internet.
In the movie, you mentioned that this kind of push by the big corporations to buy up some of what we might consider public resources started about 3 decades ago. Was there any specific legislation that opened the door to that? Was there a switch in kind of the ethics of people? I mean, how did it kind of start?
Well, it had its origins of the business backlash against the consumer and environmental movement in the late 60s and early 70s, where Chamber of Commerce General Counsel Lewis Powell, who later became Supreme Court Justice, wrote a memo saying, we, the business community, need to counter-mobilize. They did, and when Reagan and Margaret Thatcher took office in 1981, that began the consolidation of what's often called the neoliberal capitalist version of capitalism, which put its emphasis on deregulation, slashing government budgets, fostering international flows of capital, and privatization of government resources. So that was the time when a lot of things took off. And coincident with that, you had such things as the Supreme Court declaring that life could be patented. And so you had the whole rise of owned species and living organisms. So a lot of this started in 1980, and it has since accelerated over the past 30 years.
I'll remind our audience we're speaking with David Bollier. The movie is This Land is Our Land. There's a screening Sunday, November 14th, 7:30 p.m. It's to benefit the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts. So if you're a local listener, there will be a Q&A with you and with Sut Jolly from Media Education Foundation. Is that right?
That's right. We'll both be there for a while answering your questions.
My advice, I've been to some of these things before. The number of questions that you start getting where it's the same question 5 or 10 different times can get out of hand. So if I were you, I would have a set time where you're just out of there, because I'll tell you, it can get ugly.
Okay, I'll be prepared.
Okay, well, thanks so much for coming in. We invite you to check out the movie and, of course, tickets at amhercinema.org. And your personal website is?
Bollier.org.
Okay, and you have just a wealth of information there about the history and kind of upcoming things that we need to be aware of related to the commons, don't you?
Well, the commons is sort of an accelerating movement, both domestically, but especially internationally in Europe and the global south. So I expect it'll wash across America sooner or later. Before
we wrap up, Republicans, Democrats, do you think one party is better, or more of a risk or more of a help to the issues of the commons?
Well, Democrats and those on the left are more aware of the abuses of the market. Republicans are more reflexively defenders of it. But the commons is less of an ideological thing than a point of view. After all, there's many conservatives that care about their local communities, and localism is really a key aspect of the commons. So it's not an ideological thing.
We've found something at least, Louis, that is not a Republican-Democrat issue? Maybe. I don't know.
I don't think such things exist.
All right, David Bollier, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.